I think the most common way that people approach a piece of horror is to treat it like a puzzle. As if there's a perfect combination of ideas that if you just combine them together in the right order, they'll form a key that cracks the whole thing wide open. Oh, I get it. I was feeling scared because the horror was a metaphor for blank. As if there has to be an explanation for everything. That there is always a definitive message and lesson to be taken away. That what you're feeling, all of that uncomfortableness, stems from a very rational place. But there's one film director where I think it is genuinely impossible to approach his work in this way, because his movies are actively designed to avoid any easy explanations. His name is Kiyoshi Kurosawa. You can feel Kurosawa's shadow over horror everywhere these days. People have cited his influence on both Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and there's also a video essay that has like 8 million views, breaking down just one scene he directed. Even Chris Stuckman's made a video on this guy. Kurosawa's two most popular films in the West are Cure and Pulse, and they often get interpreted as if they're making big political statements. I get why, all the elements are basically there. They directly engage with social issues. Cure is literally about a cop, and Pulse is a story about the internet, and they're always talking about something more complicated than just a simple scare. There's one word that comes up every time somebody watches either of these movies. Dread. Because they're paralyzing with how much fear they inject into you. And it goes without saying, they're some of the most effective horror films ever made. That being said, I wouldn't really call Kurosawa a horror filmmaker. His work doesn't have any classic tropes you'd associate with horror. There's no jump scares or gratuitous violence, and the way he describes his own work, I'm not even convinced he thinks he's making horror sometimes. You start with the genre, which is fiction, and gradually move toward reality. Somewhere in between, you find film. To put it simply, I would like to make a movie like Indy Jones, but there aren't any real people like Indy Jones. That's the beginning of my filmmaking. Kurosawa's films purposefully never give you a definitive argument, one way or another, on anything. What they're actually about is questions. See, Kurosawa's repeatedly talked about how influential one of his film professors was on his way of thinking. That guy's name was Shigehiko Hasumi, a person that almost everybody watching this video will never have heard of. I hadn't heard of him either, but simultaneously is considered one of the most influential thinkers in Japan, even outside the study of film. But what did this guy actually believe? Well, according to Aaron Giroux, Hasumi's theory of film was, cinema must be discussed as cinema, bracketing out issues of politics, society, and economy in order to understand how the film operates as a film. Basically, Hasumi's argument wasn't that films couldn't be political, it was that you shouldn't let a film's identity be entirely defined by a reading like this. At the end of the day, it is still a technical piece of work where all of the elements come together to make you feel something. It is a film first, a political film second. Now, I don't know how I feel about that, and I also don't want to think about it, but Hasumi was so influential on Kurosawa that in an interview from 2018, Kurosawa used the word cult to describe how much he looked up to Hasumi. What I'm trying to say is, Kurosawa's films are designed to be unexplainable from a single point of view. Most of the time he'll have characters that believe different things, equally represented in a film. But if Kurosawa's films do engage with political ideas, and don't misunderstand me, they absolutely do, but they also don't provide any definitive statements on them, what are his movies actually about? Well, on the most surface level, they're kinda genre films. Like movies that are designed to fit very cleanly into an already existing genre. But what's weird is, that genre doesn't have to be horror. Cure is about a police detective called Takabe, played by Koji Yakusho, who's investigating a group of murders that are all suspiciously similar. Victims keep showing up with a letter X carved into their bodies, but every time it's a different murderer, and they always admit they did it, but they have zero recollection why. But for some reason, Takabe keeps investigating anyway, even though he's done his job as a cop. Wow, I guess it really is fiction. If you're picturing movies like Seven or Silence of the Lambs, you're along the right tracks. His movie Pulse, on the other hand, has a much more traditional horror setup. It's a ghost story where all the spirits of the dead are starting to raise and invade the human world. But the method through which they do it is computers and the internet. One half of the story is about a woman named Michi who works at a flower shop, and she sees her co-workers get possessed one by one. The other half is about a himbo called Ryosuke who's studying economics at university when he suddenly starts seeing visions of ghosts on his computer. So he contacts Harue, a computer science student, to help him investigate. Pulse actually got remade in English in 2006 with 2 sequels. You know what? This movie. There's a temptation to try to read these 2 films as the work of a new filmmaker, because for the English-speaking world, Cure is the movie that introduced us to Kiyoshi Kurosawa. He launched his career internationally, and honestly, it's his most famous movie. It's in the Criterion Collection. Chris Stuckman made a video on it. Only a couple of years after Cure came out, and definitely while Pulse was out, Japanese horror became a recent trend in film that a lot of Western audiences were interested in. There was even a name for it, J-horror. It felt bold, it felt new. This stuff was so big they put The Ring in Scary Movie 3. Even though Kurosawa was clearly inspired by a generation of American film, there was nothing like his work. And let's be really clear about this, I think he likes American film more than most of us. Perhaps Zemeckis is the American film director who makes the most authentic films today. Why did Kiyoshi Kurosawa say that about the guy who directed Beowulf? Well, I guess that's reasonable if he said that in the Wait, he said that 4 years ago? I'm curious if he still thinks that now that Zemeckis has released a Pinocchio movie where he stares at horse shit. Either way, Kurosawa's career is actually more complicated than it initially looks. He had been directing TV and films for 14 straight years before Cure came out in 1997. I think if you approach Cure as a mature work, and one made by a director in his 40s, it's a lot easier to unpack it. But if you look at Kurosawa's pre-Cure movies, there's only a couple released in cinemas. Yo, that title's gotta make more sense in Japanese, right? Because the majority of where Kurosawa practiced making movies was in direct-to-video Japanese films, which Japan called V-cinema. And I think you can work out a lot of what Kurosawa was doing stylistically if you consider Cure and Pulse as a continuation of this era of his career. See, American direct-to-video films came into existence because there was a gap in the market. The American film industry didn't want to put their movies on home video, and only gave in once they realized they could make more money by doing it, because people were renting films far more than they were going to the cinema. But the demand for VHS was so high in the 80s and 90s, they physically could not produce enough movies on tape to keep up with it. So third-party companies entered the market and would make films very quickly because they knew people would rent anything. V-cinema, on the other hand, is kinda similar, but it was directly created and supported by the Japanese film industry. The same studios that were releasing theatrical films also made direct-to-video film. In the early 90s, Japan's economy collapsed. I have another video on that if you want to know more about it, but what it meant was V-cinema suddenly looked far more attractive to studios. And because the movies were made on a tiny budget, they were pretty much guaranteed to make money. You didn't have to pay money to advertise these films either. People weren't discovering them by seeing adverts. They found them by going to a rental store, spotting a cool box, and then taking the thing home. And to be real, the demand for home video was so high, they didn't even really need to be good. They just needed to exist. These films were getting made start to finish in the space of a couple weeks. Tom Mess, in his book Japanese Film and the Challenge of Video, points out that in 1989, there were 840 million rentals of home video in Japan, but the amount of cinema tickets that were sold were only 143 million. This ended up creating a side effect because it meant your films could be more political, they could show more violence, because they didn't have to be censored to appeal to advertisers or cinema or TV standards. So even on the production side, V-cinema films were attractive for creative reasons as well. Even the filmmakers and producers had reasons to make them beyond just money. This is what made V-cinema so different to American direct-to-video film. The production process meant Kurosawa had very little oversight on what he was doing. He could experiment on how he wanted to shoot stuff, what genre he wanted to work in, and he also wrote all of his V-cinema films too. As long as he turned in a movie at the end of the day, he had a lot of room to experiment. From 1994 till the release of Cure in 1997, Kurosawa made 12 films. They were comedies, crime movies, action films, most of the time all three together, such as Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself the Heist, Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself the Escape, Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself the Loot, Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself the Gamble, Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself the Nouveau Riche, Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself the Hero, and Yakuza Taxi. V-cinema eventually died out due to the rise of DVD and the general decline of renting films. but it still kickstarted the careers of some of the most influential Japanese filmmakers of the 2000s and today: Takashi Miike, Shinji Aoyama, and Kiyoshi Kurosawa. Tom Mess, in the same book from earlier, argues that you could even think of Kurosawa's Cure spiritually as a V-cinema film because of how much of that DNA makes it into it. For example, the director of photography on Cure is a guy Kurosawa worked with for at least 7 other movies before Cure. He worked with the editor of Pulse on a couple of other V-cinema films. It even goes as far as his producers. Atsuyuki Shimoda produced both Cure and Pulse, and like 7 of Kurosawa's V-cinema films before them. Where I think you can sense this the most is in Kurosawa's location and art design. Both Pulse and Cure are credited to Tomoyuki Maro, and he worked with Kurosawa on 8 different movies before they made Cure in 1997. Kurosawa's locations always feel like extensions of his main characters. They're barren, they've been stripped away to have so much voided space fill the frame. When he shoots in interiors, they're always run down and painted with these dull colors, like they've been forgotten and abandoned. It's not that they're dead, they feel like they're still alive, but at some point, all of the humanity was drained out of them. These places were designed to be used, and now they have. The one word that keeps entering my mind when I look at them is emptiness. But it's not a quiet and lonely emptiness. It's toxic and corrosive. It's always bubbling away in every moment, especially through the sound design, and it wears down everything. It goes from scene to scene, infecting each corner it comes across. If we think of this emptiness like a virus, what does that make the Cure? Most of Cure is about the conflict between its 2 main characters. Takabe is a detective, like I mentioned earlier, but the person he's chasing is Mamiya. Through some form of ancient hypnotism, Mamiya manages to convince all of these seemingly ordinary civilians to commit murder. And the film makes clear Mamiya isn't rewriting their brains or anything, he's simply making their natural tendencies come out. I've watched this movie so many times, but what always strikes me is how that theme of emptiness is reflected across both of its main characters. Mamiya is much more upfront about it. He says he has no name, he always speaks short sentences, and he's constantly asking questions and probing other people for their personal information. Even in the scene where we see Mamiya's apartment, where you might expect furniture, it's instead filled with tons and tons of data. Cold volumes of books, sociological reports, clippings of newspapers. Even though I'm staring at proof of Mamiya's historical existence as a human, it feels like it belongs to another person. Like he's a hollow vessel. On the other hand, Takabe is a married man. His wife suffers from schizophrenia and frequently has episodes that affect Takabe mentally. Sometimes she'll serve him raw meat, and other times she'll run out of the house without telling anyone. But even Takabe's home feels devoid of personality. There's barely any defining characteristics. It looks like how your house looks when the landlord tells you he's coming over. I think the most interesting parallel is that anytime Mamiya is on screen, there's this giant droning sound in the score playing underneath him. But when we're in Takabe's home, that same sound plays again, but it's in the film. It's being done by his wife. One of her frequent schizophrenic episodes is turning on the dryer while it's empty and creating that noise. You can learn so much about Takabe every time he appears on screen. There's a great scene towards the start of the film where Takabe is talking to a psychologist friend of his. And anytime Takabe starts talking about the case, he comes forward and shows his face to the camera and us. But anytime his personal life comes up, Takabe not only walks away from us, but straight up out of the shot, and the camera has to move to keep up with him. It's a really effective way of showing that Takabe chooses to be isolated and absorbed by his work, because he doesn't want to confront the reality of his wife's condition. If you were, say, a mad killer hypnotist, this is probably what you would target. There's something else I really like about this scene. It's all one take. It goes from here to here to here without a single cut. This is something that I think transferred over from Kurosawa's V-cinema movies. It's even in his comedy ones. But here, the long takes are never flashy and they don't really draw any attention to themselves. Instead, they're suffocating. You want the movie to cut away, just so you could take a moment to breathe. One of the things we kinda take for granted about film is that it's literally limited by the frame of the movie. Nothing exists outside of that rectangle we see. So films have to actively battle against that psychological feeling to try to create the illusion of a 3D space. Cure is so good at subtly doing this that you don't even really notice it. There's an interview Kurosawa gave in 2003 where he says this: "I always try to convey a sense that space continues outside of the frame. In other words, what's visible is definitive, but the invisible parts of space outside the frame should have some effect on the visible part captured in the frame. It may be very subtle, or it may be very strong. It can vary, but the invisible part of space outside the frame must be affecting the visible part in some way." I think the most effective way he realizes this is through his use of long takes. It makes it feel like the space the film is showing extends outside of the frame somehow. So when Kurosawa then does choose to move to a close-up, it feels even tighter because you know how much invisible space is around it. It's like he's making the frame feel bigger than it actually is, as if the eye of the camera is excruciatingly close. It makes me think of that emptiness again. Something that's so pervasive in every scene, and we can feel it's always there around the characters, but we just can't see it. The year after Cure came out, Kurosawa put out a movie called Eyes of the Spider, which again he made in the space of 2 weeks because he's crazy. There's a moment in this movie which I think is the closest Kurosawa ever got to putting a thesis in a movie of his. One character looks at another and says, "Emptiness isn't misery, it's the beginning of something new." It's worth mentioning that the idea that emptiness is inherently bad is a very Western way of looking at it. Buddhists, for example, would look at emptiness as a beneficial thing, a state that lets you reflect on yourself and then you can use that to grow from. But what if somebody tried to start poisoning your thoughts? In Cure, the emptiness isn't evil, but it is being weaponized by Mamiya. Honestly, I think Pulse is even better at exploring this feeling. It's all about how the ghosts are preying on people's loneliness and exploiting it so they can invade the human world. It's kind of funny because the most common interpretation of Pulse is like, it's pretty good, but it's aged like milk. I mean, to be fair, it is a movie about the internet made way back in 2001. That's 2 years before The Matrix Reloaded, and 16 years before the Emoji Movie. There's genuinely a scene in Pulse where the himbo main character tells the hot computer scientist lady that he's seeing ghosts on his monitor, and she tells him to bookmark the page the next time it happens. And he starts taking out a notepad and writing down instructions on how to do it. That is so old that not only does everybody know how to bookmark a page now, they also don't do it. They just type in the website and hope Firefox gets close enough. The way most people analyze Pulse is that it's a story about how computers and the internet isolate us, while ironically attempting to bring us together. I disagree. Kurosawa's a filmmaker who's always been interested in the idea of communication, how we talk to one another, and more importantly, what's left unsaid. Which is why it's so funny that despite how badly Pulse's representation of the internet has aged, it's also one of the only movies I've seen that actually understands what the internet is. Anytime the internet is represented in stories, it's treated like a foreign world entirely that we enter, as if it's a binary state. In this moment I'm online, in this moment I'm offline. This isn't how it works. I think it's more effective to think of the internet as a prosthesis, as an extension of the human body. There's a writer called Nathan Jurgensen who's been arguing for years now that we need to start thinking of the internet in a new way. It's not a distant world that we enter and leave through our phones. Our experience of life is a combination of being online and offline at the exact same time. Our lives make up the blood that pumps through the internet and keeps it breathing. Jurgensen summarizes his idea like this: "I've argued that online and offline, like body and mind, aren't like two positions on a light switch, a perspective I've called digital dualism. Instead, all social life is made of both information and material. It's technological and human, virtual and real." What I love about this framing is that it's not saying the internet changed the way we think. It just revealed more about how we think. And if there's one thing that Kiyoshi Kurosawa loves to make movies about, it's social life. The reason why Pulse is one of the best movies about discussing the internet is because it isn't saying anything about the internet. It just uses the medium of the internet to discuss humans. One of the most important scenes in Pulse happens 36 minutes into the film, where Ryosuke comes across this program that somebody's coded. It draws dots randomly across the screen, and if two of them ever get too close, they both die. But if any dot ever goes too far from another one, they'll start to magnetize other dots towards them. One way of interpreting this is that it's a metaphor for how the internet works. The more interesting way to think of it is that it's an examination of how life in the 90s and 2000s worked in Japan. Cure and Pulse are in one sense incredibly timeless films, but in another, they're specifically in conversation with the time period they came out in. In one of the interviews I showed earlier, Kurosawa mentions how he feels about his generation. He says he thinks the generation before him have pretty strong opinions on politics, and that the generation younger than him have pretty strong opinions on hobbies and life, but that his generation feels sandwiched between these two, and that everything about their lives is uncertain and indefinite. In Mark Yamada's article, The Post-Ohm Films of Kurosawa Kiyoshi, he presents an answer to what Kurosawa might mean by this. Since the majority of Kurosawa's career took place after the Japanese economy crashed in the 90s, it's possible to read his films as haunted by the effects of that. The loss of the middle class, the constant thoughts of what a potentially successful Japanese society could look like. Yamada doesn't just say Kurosawa's films are horror films, he argues that they're about actualizing the specific act of trauma. And Pulse starts to make a lot more sense in this way. Multiple people have pointed out that Pulse doesn't just feel depressing, it feels apocalyptic. The film actually begins on a boat in the ocean, and the rest of it takes place as a flashback. So even the narrative feels like the story of a survivor. And the ghosts never feel angry or anything like that. They're quiet, they're slow moving. Their strength comes in the fact they're oppressive and controlling. Pulse will go as far as to even start influencing your behavior. It keeps forcing the camera to take the perspective of someone else. At first, it's just us looking at the same screen through the eyes of the main characters, but pretty soon after that, once the film starts introducing blurry ghosts and scenes draped in shadows, we have to start looking closely to try to figure out what we're even seeing. The film is shot with so much film grain that it's not clear most of the time. And we're not just seeing like the characters, we're forced to think like them too. There's moments where the ghosts will call main characters on their phones and whisper to them. And it is a whisper. You have to listen closely to make out what they're saying. I think it's this act of interpretation that makes Cure and Pulse far more terrifying than most other horror films. You have to participate in the film. Every second that goes by, it's asking for more of you. You are willingly giving up a piece of yourself to try to make sense of it. There's no cuts, they're not movies with jump scares, you just look at something happening and it terrifies you. Because you don't understand it, so you decide to pull back. It's a dehumanizing process. The movie is making you close part of yourself off. Specifically, the part that lets you reach out and empathize with other people. Miguel Caesar, in his essay, Why Isn't There Anybody? Isolation and Loneliness in Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Pulse, points out 3 pieces of context to help understand Kurosawa's output during this period. 1. The city of Kobe suffered an earthquake in 1995 that killed over 6,200 people and destroyed over a third of the city. 3 months after this, there was the sarin gas attack perpetrated by members of the cult Aum Shinrikyo, where they poisoned people traveling on the Tokyo subway system. 13 people passed away and more than 6,000 were injured. And finally, again in Kobe and on the final day Cure was being filmed in 1997, a 14-year-old child was arrested for murder of 2 other children at the school he attended. All 3 of these incidents ended up reverberating across Japan, but Caesar points out 2 main takeaways from this. 1. Not only did this cause massive distrust in government bodies, but 2. It also signified the traditional Japanese idea of a family had been essentially destroyed. This was something that was already being discussed in Japanese film as well, at least as early as 1983. The film The Family Game, directed by Yoshimitsu Morita, is all about exploring that issue, how families drift apart and barely know each other. It was exceptionally popular and influential on other Japanese directors. It's probably not a coincidence that in 2008, Kurosawa directed a movie that has no ghosts, no detectives, no hypnotists, nothing. It's called Tokyo Sonata, and it's a drama about the destruction of the nuclear family. The humans in Pulse don't become ghosts by dying, they become ghosts by giving up. And it isn't death that scares them, but the fact that if they become ghosts, they'll instead be forced to live forever. Because unlike the internet, which is this digital dualism malaise of online and offline, death is a binary state. In one moment you're alive, in another you're dead. How can you expect someone to be scared of something as definite and quiet as death when they're surrounded by undecipherable suffering day to day in life? Miguel Caesar makes one final point that I think is incredibly effective at unlocking what Kurosawa was doing in these two films. While nature was feared because it was not human, technology is feared because it is human-made. Both of these films repeatedly underline that we can never know what's going on in someone else's head. Some of the scariest moments in either is when there's such little disregard for human life. What are they thinking? How do they justify it? They're movies designed from the ground up to require your participation, your interpretation to pull a meaning out of them. But no matter how hard you try to pull at the fabric of the stories, there is no answer. How can you expect the horror to be rational when the reasons for it existing aren't? You could look at Kurosawa's career, his teachers, his influences, how he directs a scene, his politics, his society at the time, but you will never get any closer to understanding why it terrifies you and it bothers you. Because these films have taught you that something in the world out there scares you, and there is no explanation for it. You'll pick at every mental abscess, hoping you'll find out why you feel this way, and it kills you because you know that feeling is right. There is something terrifying out there. Something you can't see, and you don't know what, but it scares you more than anything else you've ever felt. All you want is the cure. Yo, it's Jay. Thanks for making it this far into the video. If you'd like to help support me, check out patreon.com/lowercase j. Even $1 goes a long way to helping make more videos like this. As always, thank you to the patrons who let me make this stuff. And this time, I'd like to especially thank Akira Game Dev, Big Lou, Descanny Man, Live a Live, Manev Care, Mox Bagel, New Church, Ravi Dosanjh, The Fragrance of Dark Coffee, and Vague Type. If you're not sick of me, I also host a film podcast called Labyrinth of Cinema, and I'm also on Blue Sky. I'm on Blue Sky. Thanks for watching. See you next time.